No one tells the full story about Russia's Shadow Fleet, but the US Navy just brought it into the open in the harshest possible way. At 3:14 a.m. in the Bay of Biscay, aboard the French aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle, a young radar operator spots something that should not be there. A small drone with an extremely low radar signature has just launched from the deck of the Zhigulevsk, a Russian Project 864 intelligence ship posing as a research vessel only 12 miles away. The drone is moving in at 145 miles per hour, and inside the Combat Information Center, the Tactical Action Officer has only 18 seconds to decide whether this is a surveillance pass or the opening move of a direct threat. If that drone is carrying even a small payload and reaches a critical section of the flight deck, the French flagship could be forced out of action in an instant. But France is not standing alone. 50 miles to the north, the USS Arleigh Burke has already picked up the track through a satellite data link. The Russian commander aboard the Zhigulevsk believes he is measuring NATO's reaction time. What he is about to learn is that the response will be more than quick. It will be unforgiving. To understand why the US Navy answered with such overwhelming intensity, you have to go back 3 weeks earlier, to the North Sea. The British frigate HMS Richmond was monitoring a group of Russian Shadow Fleet tankers, aging uninsured ships Moscow uses to work around oil sanctions. According to the IISS, these vessels are more than a sanctions loophole. They are also floating sensor platforms. Then, without warning, HMS Richmond's bridge was hit by a high-energy optical dazzler, a military-grade laser fired from a Russian tug trailing the tankers. The goal was not to sink the ship. The goal was to blind the crew and disable the frigate's electro-optical systems. For 45 seconds, the British warship was effectively unable to see in one of the world's busiest shipping lanes. Moscow used that moment to study NATO's hesitation gap. They wanted to know whether the British would respond with force or fall back. When London followed standard maritime procedure and issued a diplomatic protest, the Kremlin took it as permission to push further. In their view, NATO was too restricted by legal rules of engagement to answer grey zone pressure in real time. That was their first and biggest miscalculation. While Russia was busy interpreting the British response as weakness, the US 6th Fleet was already updating engagement software across every destroyer in the Atlantic. They were building a kill web designed to turn Russia's hybrid tactics into a trap that moved faster than any commander could react to. Then came the Bay of Biscay. The Zhigulevsk incident, reported by Defense UA, marked the moment Russia moved beyond pressure tactics and into something far more dangerous. By sending a drone straight toward a French carrier during the Pian exercise, Moscow crossed a line. In the view of the US Navy, this was no longer intimidation. It was clear, hostile intent. You do not move against a carrier, the centerpiece of NATO's power projection, and expect nothing more than a calm warning over the radio. The Zhigulevsk was not a traditional warship. It was an intelligence platform loaded with antennas and signal collection systems built to capture Western electronic activity. By launching that drone, the Russians were trying to force Charles de Gaulle to activate its high-power fire control radars. The calculation was straightforward. Send a cheap drone, pressure the French into using radar systems worth hundreds of millions, collect the frequencies, and pass the data to electronic warfare teams in Kaliningrad. It was a low-cost gamble with potentially massive payoff. But the US Navy had no intention of letting the French play into that plan. Inside USS Arleigh Burke, the Aegis combat system was running in passive multi-static mode, a capability Russia clearly had not accounted for. Instead of broadcasting signals that could be detected and analyzed, the destroyer was simply listening to the electromagnetic noise already filling the air. Commercial satellite traffic, television transmissions, even emissions from the Russian ship's own older navigation radar. By tracking how those existing signals reflected off the incoming drone, Arleigh Burke built a precise firing solution without transmitting a single watt. At 3:16 a.m., the tactical action officer aboard the destroyer gave the order. Batteries released, bird away. A Mark 41 vertical launch cell burst open and a RIM-162E SSM tore into the night sky. This was not a routine interception. The missile was guided by a remote track provided by the French carrier's passive infrared sensors. That is what the kill web looks like in practice. The US Navy provided the strike, while the French provided the targeting picture. The drone never had a real chance to react. The ESSM, able to pull extreme maneuvers and fly at well over 1,900 miles per hour, hit it 5 miles from the carrier. The blast itself was limited. The message behind it was impossible to miss, and that was only the start. The US response was not just about bringing down a drone, it was about removing the threat's ability to operate at all. 2 EA-18G Growlers, already circling 30,000 feet above the Bay of Biscay, turned toward the Zhigulevsk. They did not launch missiles. They unleashed a concentrated electronic attack. The crews activated ALQ-218 tactical jamming systems and directed a narrow, high-intensity beam of electronic interference straight into the Russian ship's antenna array. On board the Zhigulevsk, confusion spread instantly. Displays inside the signal intelligence suite were washed out by static. Their satellite connection to Moscow was cut off. In a matter of moments, the ship that had tried to collect NATO's electronic signature was left struggling to understand its own battlefield picture. Their internal communications dissolved into waves of piercing feedback. In barely 3 minutes, Russia's most sophisticated spy ship in the Atlantic had been reduced to little more than a $200 million hulk drifting without control. And while the crew was still trying to understand why their radios were melting down, the sea itself delivered the next shock. About 400 yards off the starboard bow, the water began to boil. First came a dark steel tower, then the hull, then the full 560-foot shape of a nuclear-powered predator rising from the ocean. USS Florida, an Ohio-class guided missile submarine, had surfaced in plain view. A submarine does not appear that close to an opposing vessel by accident. It means it has been beneath them for hours, maybe longer, completely undetected. And Florida was not there as a spectator. It carries 154 Tomahawk cruise missiles. The message was unmistakable. This was never just about a drone. The U.S. Navy was telling the Russian commander, without saying a word, that they had been inside his shadow the entire time and could have ended the situation before it even began. Then came the final layer of pressure. USS Arleigh Burke surged to 34 miles per hour and began a fast, deliberate circle around the Russian vessel. It did not simply hold position nearby. It moved with purpose, turning the encounter into a visible demonstration of control. Its Mark 45 5-inch deck gun was aimed directly at the Zhigulevsk's bridge. At the same time, the destroyer's fire control system locked onto the ship for the RIM-66 Standard MR. That matters because the RIM-66 may be known primarily as an air defense missile, but it also has a surface strike role capable of tearing through a ship's upper structure in seconds. The Russian commander could see exactly what was happening. He could see American sailors on deck. He could see the optics tracking his ship with cold precision. In that moment, he was trapped from every angle, jammed from the air, controlled from the surface, and watched from beneath the sea. The IISS has warned that Russia's Shadow Fleet is not just a sanctions workaround. It is a hybrid tool, blending commercial cover with military purpose. But in the Bay of Biscay, the U.S. Navy made one thing clear. Disguise only works when no one is paying attention. NATO is now operating with a level of shared awareness that leaves very little hidden. With systems like the RIM-174 Standard ERAM on standby, the balance shifts even further. This missile is one of the most flexible interceptors in existence, able to engage ballistic threats high above the atmosphere, cruise missiles skimming low, and even surface targets far beyond the horizon. During the encounter, Arleigh Burke reportedly had multiple RIM-174s ready to fire. If Russia had launched a second drone or attempted any kind of response, the answer would have arrived before their next move was fully underway. But the most important part of the response was not a single missile, submarine, or aircraft. It was the coordination. That was the real message. Russia's broader strategy depends on NATO reacting as separate nations with separate interests. They assumed the laser incident involving the British would stay isolated. They assumed the United States would avoid stepping into a confrontation involving a French carrier. They assumed each country would respond alone. Instead, they faced a system that moved as one. The British contributed intelligence on Russian laser tactics. The French supplied the sensor picture that tracked the incoming drone. The Americans delivered the intercept that shut the situation down. What Russia expected to be a test of NATO hesitation became a demonstration of NATO integration. And that may be the most important shift of all. The Shadow Fleet is no longer operating in the dark. Every tanker, every auxiliary ship, every so-called research vessel is now under far closer watch. What once looked like a hidden network now looks a lot more like a target set. Their engine patterns, radio behavior, and even the vibration profile of their hulls were all captured and added to the U.S. Navy's database. Russia tried to hide military advantage behind civilian shipping. Instead, they handed NATO something even more valuable: a working map of their covert logistics network. The deeper reason Russia failed comes down to decision superiority. On the Russian side, the commander of the Zhigulevsk likely could not act freely. A move like launching that drone may have required approval from higher command, whether from the Northern Fleet or straight from Moscow. On the American side, the tactical action officer aboard Arleigh Burke had the authority to defend the force immediately, without waiting for Washington to weigh in. The difference changes everything. The U.S. kill chain from detection to the launch of a RIM-162 ESSM operates in seconds. The Russian chain moves in minutes. By the time Moscow understood the drone had been destroyed, USS Florida was already breaking the surface. By the time retreat orders could be organized, the Growlers had already cut the ship's communications. For the entire 12-minute encounter, the U.S. Navy stayed several moves ahead of Russian decision-making. That is what decades of investment in network-centric warfare looks like in real time. Russia may have powerful missiles and fast ships, but it does not have the web. It does not have the ability to connect a British sensor, a French carrier, and an American missile into one seamless response. Without that kind of integration, even impressive hardware becomes isolated pieces on the board, vulnerable before the fight has fully begun. And for all the technology involved, from advanced interceptors to billion-dollar submarines, that night still belonged to the sailors. Think about the crew of HMS Richmond. They took the laser strike, held their nerve, stayed on station, collected the data, and passed it forward. That information helped the U.S. Navy identify the electronic signature of Russian interference later in the crisis. Think too about the tactical action officer on Arleigh Burke. He watched a Russian vessel cross the line, and he did not hesitate. He followed the escalation sequence with absolute precision. Stop the threat, blind the aggressor, then make the consequences unmistakably clear. And when the sun rose over the Bay of Biscay at 6 a.m., Charles de Gaulle was still launching aircraft. The carrier remained operational, the mission continued, and Russia had learned in the clearest possible way that testing NATO's response no longer means finding hesitation. It means finding a system that reacts faster, coordinates better, and hits harder than expected. The carrier's flight deck quickly returned to routine operations, as if the incident had never taken place. USS Arleigh Burke resumed its assigned escort position, and USS Florida slipped back beneath the surface, vanishing once again into the depths. In Russian media, there was no public narrative about the encounter, only silence followed. Because it is difficult to explain to an audience that a so-called advanced intelligence ship was effectively outmatched in real time by a single U.S. destroyer operating alongside a submarine that appeared and disappeared without warning. The incident in the Bay of Biscay became, in strategic terms, a serious miscalculation. Russia had attempted to use shadow fleet assets and hybrid pressure tactics to expose weakness in NATO coordination. Instead, the outcome demonstrated the opposite, a level of integration and responsiveness they had not accounted for. The U.S. Navy's response was not driven by emotion. It was procedural, structured, and precise. The objective was not simply to stop a single drone, but to remove the adversary's ability to operate effectively within that battle space. In practical terms, the Russian vessel lost the initiative, the coordination, and the freedom to act in any meaningful way during the engagement. The broader implication is straightforward. The so-called gray zone is becoming far less forgiving for operations that depend on ambiguity and delay. Whether it is laser interference in the North Sea or unmanned systems approaching a carrier group in the Bay of Biscay, modern naval networks are increasingly designed to detect, share, and respond across platforms and nations in real time. In that environment, escalation does not begin with warnings. It begins with detection, and response is no longer isolated. It is connected, layered, and immediate. For the world's most capable naval forces, the message is not framed as drama or spectacle. It is operational reality. Maritime rules are enforced by those who can coordinate faster, see farther, and act across domains without delay. Russia attempted to make a move on the board, but the U.S. Navy effectively reminded them who controls the playing field. For the crew aboard USS Arleigh Burke, the situation quickly de-escalated back into routine operations. The engagement was logged, processed, and fully assessed. Within a short time, it was no longer an active crisis, just another completed intercept in a highly structured operational environment. Meanwhile, the Russian vessel began its withdrawal toward the Baltic, likely carrying a far clearer understanding of how quickly the situation had turned against it. If this scenario were ever to escalate into a full-scale conflict, that brief 12-minute window would not end with a submarine surfacing or aircraft repositioning. It would end with far less visibility and far fewer second chances. The most striking element of the entire sequence is not a single platform or weapon system, but the coordination behind it. The ability to integrate data from multiple allied assets, combining sensors, intelligence feeds, and firing solutions across different navies, is what defines modern maritime power in this kind of scenario. Another notable factor is the psychological pressure created by layered presence. A destroyer on the surface, air assets overhead, and a submarine operating unseen below. Even without firing additional weapons, that level of positioning alone can reshape decision-making in real time. Ultimately, this type of engagement highlights a broader shift in naval operations. Speed of information, shared awareness, and coordinated response now matter as much as individual platforms. In that environment, isolated action becomes increasingly difficult, while networked response becomes decisive. And with that, the lesson remains consistent. Modern maritime dominance is less about single moments of action and more about who can see, decide, and respond first across an entire connected system.